Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Factory Reset podcast. We're trying to recover earliest Christianity. How would we basically think and live as Christians if we had lived soon after the apostles? In this episode, I would like to talk about Jesus' teaching on salvation as relationship. And I would ask that you try to listen with an open mind, because this may not sit well with you at first, depending on what kind of church you're in, what kind of theological tradition you identify with. When I was in college in 2002 is when God first spoke to me, revealed himself to me in a powerful way. And I gave my life to Jesus in the best way I knew how at the time. I didn't really understand the gospel very well, but what I did have was an obedient faith. I was ready to just do whatever Jesus said, no matter the cost. I didn't care. I was ready to go all in. And my life changed in some big ways almost overnight. And in the weeks and months after my conversion, I remember I would sit on my bed in my dorm at night and I would just adore Jesus. And I would actually say out loud, "I love Jesus." And I would say that, and I really meant it. It amazed me that I could say that from the heart. And it was like this consuming passion. And I was so excited to live my whole life for Jesus and to try to make as big a difference for him as I could. But then over the course of time, something went horribly wrong. I started out with a lot of zeal. My intention had been to live my whole life for Jesus. But then as time went by, as the years passed, I could never seem to become the kind of disciple that you read about in the New Testament. It was like I couldn't get off the ground in a certain kind of way. And I fizzled out and I cooled off and I got distracted. And in 2015, 13 years after that initial conversion, my life was a total mess. I was in the local church. I was a faithful member. I was in community groups and ministries and those kind of things. But my life was a mess. I was addicted to pornography and masturbation. My marriage had failed, partially due to that addiction. I was planning to find a new wife, even though my wife was still out there. And I was very relaxed in my faith. I was more interested in my bench press and in the latest big TV show or movie than I was in making every day count for Jesus. I was spending most of my time and money on things that were just for me and my own enjoyment. And so I was living a very typical, casual, American evangelical life. Instead of becoming a sharpened tool in God's hand, I had become like a wet noodle. And it was reading the Gospels in 2015, as well as a series of conversations with some Christian men who challenged my reformed evangelical perspective, that began to wake me up to just how badly I had been derailed. And I came to a passage in Luke 13 that cut me to the heart. After warning a group of people who seemed not to really understand what he was saying, Jesus told the following parable, starting in verse 6. A man had a fig tree growing in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, "For 3 years now I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" "Sir," the man replied, "leave it alone for 1 more year. I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, then cut it down." So I read that, and I felt like that fruitless tree. I felt like I let Jesus down. I was supposed to follow him with all my heart all the days of my life. What happened? How did I get to this place? Maybe I had a little shriveled fruit on my branches. There were some areas of my life that had changed, and I didn't go back to my old ways in those areas. I wasn't having premarital sex anymore. I wasn't getting high like I was in high school. I was in church. I was making an attempt to tell people about Jesus here and there. But I knew I'm not the kind of disciple that you read about in the scriptures. I was stunted in my growth, like the seed that gets choked by the thorns. And I imagine myself as that barren fig tree or a near barren fig tree. And the vineyard owner and the man who works the vineyard, they're looking at me and they're examining the fruit or lack thereof, and they're talking about what they should do with me. And the vineyard owner says, well, what do you think? Maybe we should cut it down. And the vineyard worker says, look, let's just give it one more shot. I'll break up the soil around it. I'll water it. I'll put on some fertilizer. I'll prune the branches. And let's just see what happens. I felt like God was mercifully letting me know that I needed to wake up and repent and turn things around. I knew that He loved me. I knew He was in my life. But I sensed that I was in serious danger. Well, in the first episode, I discussed Jesus' teaching on salvation as a journey, a path of death to self that we follow Him down that's going to lead to glorious life if we endure to the end. And Jesus gave His life to get us to take that journey with Him, not to make salvation easy or unconditional. This episode is about another teaching of Jesus where He describes salvation in a similar way, but with different imagery. And is a teaching that you're not going to hear in many evangelical churches today, and that's because it flies in the face of Reformation theology. This teaching of Jesus produces joy and hope. It also produces fear and trembling. And we need all of that today. And I think most of us desperately need a lot more of the latter. We have got to recover what Jesus is saying here. The episode will be divided into 3 parts. First, I'll briefly discuss some very simple things Jesus says in John 15. Second, I'll talk about the difference between what we often hear today in our churches about salvation and what Jesus teaches here, and why His teaching makes a whole lot more sense. And third, I'll address 2 arguments that some Christians use today to try to escape from what Jesus is saying in John 15. So first, let's look at this teaching of Jesus in John 15. In this passage, as in Matthew 16, which we looked at in the last episode, Jesus describes an ongoing process of salvation. But instead of talking about it in terms of a journey we take with Him, He talks about it in terms of an ongoing relational connection with Him, a connection that He urges us to remain in, to abide in. Now, before I read His words, I want you to just think about this. If you're a Protestant evangelical, then chances are you have some very deeply ingrained ideas in your mind about salvation. You likely believe that salvation is something that's by grace alone, which requires no effort on your part, even though obedience may be the evidence of salvation. And you also may believe that your past, present, and future sins are unconditionally forgiven once you believe in Jesus. And therefore, once you are saved, you cannot possibly be condemned. You cannot possibly lose that saving connection to Jesus. And if that's you, or if that's at least close to what you believe, then this teaching of Jesus is going to force you to do one of two things. Either you're going to be forced to adjust your theology. You're going to have to let go of some of those things you believe about salvation and open up to a different perspective. And that's a very uncomfortable thing to do. Or if you want to hold on to your Protestant evangelical kind of way of thinking about salvation, then you're going to be forced to interpret these words of Jesus in a very unnatural way. Okay, I'll read a few verses from John 15. I'm going to jump around a little bit for the sake of time. Please go and read the whole thing for yourself and just look at what Jesus plainly says there. But here are a few verses that I want to focus in on. In verses 1 and 2, Jesus says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Verses 5 and 6. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. Verses 9 through 11. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. Okay, let's just read what the words say and let them lead us to the natural conclusion that most anyone would come to without any theological commitments keeping them from that conclusion. A few simple points. Number one, branches on the vine obviously represent believers. Here Jesus is talking directly to the apostles, and he calls them branches, but he also speaks broadly about people who are in him. He talks about every branch in him that either bears fruit or doesn't bear fruit. And of course, there's only one kind of person who is in Jesus, who is connected to him like a branch on a vine, and that is a saved person, a genuine Christian. And Jesus says that some of those people will not bear fruit, while others will. Number two, God cuts off any branch, any person who is in Jesus who does not bear fruit. So people who have been connected to Jesus, who do not show some kind of life change that God, the gardener, is looking for, will at some point be disconnected. Number three, the unfruitful branches representing unfruitful Christians wind up in hell. This is the most natural way to understand what Jesus means when he says that branches are cut off and thrown on the fire. That people who are connected to him, who do not show some kind of transformation that God wants to see, will eventually lose that connection and will be cast into hell. And four, bearing fruit means keeping the commandments of Jesus. Jesus wants us to remain attached to him, and he wants us to have his joy in us. And he tells us how that can happen, how to remain in this saving connection. He says that if we keep his commandments, we will remain in his love. So when you bring all this together, it sounds like Obedience to Jesus' commandments is that fruit that God is looking for. And that's what will keep us remaining on, abiding in the vine, Jesus. It's going to keep us in this saving connection, and we'll be pruned to bear more fruit and to keep growing rather than being cut off. For the last couple of months, I've been working in landscaping, and a lot of what I've been doing has been apple tree pruning. And it's pretty simple stuff. I look for branches that have no apples. Those branches generally get cut off. Other branches have a few apples. Some of them even have one or two hanging off the end of them, and you look at them and you're not sure, could go either way. And so you prune them and you hope that they start popping out some more apples. And then other branches, they have plenty of apples, and you prune those too to keep them healthy and bearing more and more apples. And so God is like an apple tree pruner. He's looking at the branches that are attached to Jesus, and what are the, quote, apples that he's looking for? Well, it sounds like, from what Jesus is saying here, that what he's looking for is obedience to Jesus. People who take Jesus seriously and obey what he commands, which according to Jesus shows that they actually love him. He makes that very clear in John 14, verses 15 and 21. And so this makes a lot of sense. A lot of people believe in Jesus in a certain way. They say they love him, but not very many people really seek to understand and obey his commandments. Not many revere him and make his commandments a central focus of their lives. And we might think that everything is okay with us and God. But if we do not obey what Jesus commanded, if we are hearers of the word but not doers, then we are deceiving ourselves. In reality, we're in danger of being cut off if we haven't been already. The other possibility is that we've never actually been attached to the vine at all. We may have heard a false gospel and we may have had a profound emotional experience, but we may never have actually begun a relationship with the true Jesus of Scripture. We may have believed in a false Christ who would never, ever talk to us in the way that Jesus talks to the apostles in places like John 15, or the way that the true Jesus talks to the churches in Revelation 2 or 3, or what Jesus says to the disciples in Luke chapter 12 in the second half of the chapter. We may not even know the real Jesus. All right, now, if you are an evangelical Christian, please don't tune me out yet, because I'm going to try to explain why all this makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot more sense than what we are often told today. So just hang in there with me, please. This condition about keeping Jesus' commandments, it sounds like trying to earn salvation to many evangelicals, which it isn't. But they have been conditioned to think in a way that makes this teaching of Jesus sound like heresy. It sounds like legalism or works righteousness to the ears of many evangelicals. And they are terrified. They're afraid of thinking that what they do contributes somehow to salvation. They actually think that if they believe that, that could cost them their salvation. And that whole way of thinking, that is a Protestant thing. That's not a biblical thing. That is not how Jesus thinks about salvation, as you can see. It's not how he teaches us to think about salvation. And you're going to find all kinds of things that Jesus says throughout the Gospels that are difficult or impossible to square with that way of thinking and the way of thinking about salvation that's taught in many evangelical churches today. And the reason that you have that tension between the words of Jesus and what is taught in many of our churches is because Jesus has a different teaching on salvation and justification than Martin Luther had. And he's sort of the founder of our movement. And it's really important for us to be able to make the distinction between the gospel of Martin Luther and John Calvin and evangelical Christianity and the gospel of Jesus and his apostles. They are not the same message, even though they use a lot of the same terminology. And once you can see the difference, you are very close to breaking free from one of the worst and most destructive deceptions of church history. Of course, we don't earn salvation. I'm not saying that. Of course not. God is never going to owe this to anybody. But Jesus is saying that we contribute to our salvation, which is very different. And there's a good reason why salvation has to require our contribution. And it's because salvation is relational. It's relational. Many of us have been taught to think about salvation as a legal matter, that it's just about trusting in a legal transaction Jesus made for us with the Father. Now, if that was the case, then yeah, that would be something that would not require any contribution on our part. We could just trust in the penal substitution that Jesus made on our behalf, and that'd be it. The problem is that's not how Jesus talks about salvation. Jesus describes a saving relationship, not a saving legal transaction. And relationships, by their very nature, are conditional. To have a relationship, a real relationship, you need two people who are both contributing. A relationship can be initiated by one person. One person can, make the first move, so to speak. It only takes one person to open the door to make the relationship possible. But then from that point on, going forward, you need two people. And if one of those two people ceases to be engaged in a certain way, well, then that connection will weaken and eventually it will die. And so this is simple, very simple stuff that we all know. Think about two people who are engaged to be married. And suppose the man starts cheating on his fiancée. Okay, well, that relationship is going to come to an end unless he stops and begins to live faithfully again. The other faithful fiancée, she can be patient, she can bear with him and plead with him for a time, but if he doesn't shape up and become faithful to her again, the wedding is going to be canceled. Because that's just the way relationships work. That faithful fiancé is not going to say something like, well, we can still get married because it's not about what my fiancé does, it's about what I do for him. Huh? No, that's not how it works. Or think about a king and his subjects. They have a certain kind of relationship. And suppose the king he's a good and just king, he's merciful, he wants to be merciful and generous with his subjects. But suppose some of the king's subjects become kind of nonchalant towards him and the decrees that he has given. If those subjects do not respond to the warnings of the king, kind of like the warnings Jesus gives us in places like John 15 maybe, well, then that relationship is going to be affected, isn't it? It's going to come to an end, and they're going to be ushered out of the kingdom or put into prison. And so the idea is that Jesus has done his part. He died. He suffered and died to free us from sin and to bring us into this saving relationship that we need to have with him. And it's available to anyone who wants it. The question is, are we going to play our part and remain in it? Will we abide in it? Will we continue to respond to him in the way he says we need to? Jesus has made this relationship possible, but he is not going to have a relationship with himself for us. That makes no sense. And that's why salvation cannot be something where Jesus does it all for us. He carried his cross for us, but he's not going to carry our cross for us. He's not going to take this journey that we need to take for us. He'll take it with us, and he'll give us the strength if we're willing and obedient. But we need to carry our own cross and obey his commandments if we are going to remain his disciples and stay on the vine connected to him. Now, honestly, does this not make a whole lot of sense of salvation? Doesn't this make a whole lot more sense of the whole New Testament? It brings it all together. We're saved by grace, right? We don't deserve to get into this relationship with Jesus. We're never going to be able to earn that. God gives that to anyone who's willing to repent, not because they earn it, but because he's kind and generous. At the very same time, Jesus is very clear. Once we come into that relationship, there are conditions to stay in it. And that's why the Gospels and the epistles are full of all kinds of warnings and admonitions that are addressed to genuine believers. Does this not make sense of everything the New Testament has to say? So what's the response to this from today's evangelical Christianity? Because, of course, the problem with this natural reading of John 15 and other passages like it is that it doesn't mesh with Reformed theology. And the other problem is that it's scary. It's really scary. I mean, especially if you have already embraced this idea that you're eternally secure and God will never let you go no matter what. It is not a pleasant experience to think that and then to contemplate the possibility that you're actually not out of danger yet. You can get cut off this vine. That's a really uncomfortable shift to make. I've experienced making that shift. It's not fun. And so Reformed leaning evangelicals or people who believe in eternal security, they may use certain tactics or arguments in order to protect their theological position or in order to protect, I think often it's to protect themselves from this scary, uncomfortable experience of seeing what Jesus is saying here. And they'll try to force this passage and others like it to fit eternal security. And it's like jamming a square peg into a round hole with a sledgehammer and then saying that it fits. Maybe more educated Christians who went to seminary or who maybe studied Greek, they might use the tactic of trying to make you feel dumb. They may start using big theological terms that you don't know, or they might start talking about Old Testament motifs, or they might ask you, hey, have you studied the Greek, or how much have you read about this or that? And of course, yeah, it's important to be aware of the bigger context of the whole Bible. It's incredibly helpful to get into the Greek. And sometimes a question like, how much Greek do you know? Or how much have you read about this or that? That can be a good question to ask someone who is proud to stop them in their tracks, for sure. But that kind of thing, it can also be a tactic to make honest, simple folks who just want to take Jesus seriously feel inferior and shut up and stop asking questions and stop challenging. It can be a way to distract from and escape from a perfectly natural way to understand a simple passage. There are also a couple of arguments on John 15, two in particular that I'll address here, that are used to try to escape from the sobering implications of this. And in my opinion, both of these arguments are a huge stretch at best. So what are these arguments? Well, the first argument is logically incoherent, but some very intelligent people use it. Earlier this year, I met a Reformed man on Facebook in a street preacher group. And we had some very friendly debate, and we ended up getting on the phone and we exchanged stories and we talked about theology. And I could tell he's very smart, he's very articulate, he's a very kind man, and he was a very good listener. And that's why I was kind of baffled when he said something to me that seemed so strange. After we talked about John 15, 1 to 10, he could not deny that branches being cut off and thrown into the fire means people going to hell. But then he explained to me that the branches which were cut off the vine were never really attached in the first place. And I was kind of stunned to hear that, especially from a guy as intelligent and thoughtful as he seemed to be. But it was the only way for him to keep his theology intact with this passage. I don't think this argument even needs a response, really, because it refutes itself. I mean, just say that to yourself. The branches that are cut off the vine were never attached? Obviously, you can't cut something off a vine if it was never attached. The idea of God disconnecting someone from Christ who was never connected to Christ in the first place, that's a logically incoherent idea. It's like a square circle or something like that. And if our theology puts us in a place where we have to say things like that, then that's a red flag and we need to reevaluate. The second argument is not as uh, not as crazy, but it's indefensible nonetheless, in my opinion. It's that the branches going into the fire in John 15, that doesn't mean going to hell, but it just means being disciplined by God in this life, or it can mean losing intimacy with God. Okay, so is it possible that Jesus is talking about the, quote, fire of God's discipline in this life? Or does the fire in this passage really just stand for some kind of loss of intimacy with God, but not the fire of hell? Well, I think the futility of that argument is going to be apparent to any objective student of the Bible who just reads this passage in the larger context of all the Gospels. Just read it in the larger context of all the teachings from both John the Baptist and Jesus, where they talk about things being cast into the fire. They talk about trees, chaff, weeds, bad fish that are thrown into the fire or into the fiery furnace. We hear parables about rich, greedy men who die and wake up in agonizing flame. We hear Jesus talk about selfish people who are cast into the eternal fire reserved for the devil and his angels. Are John and Jesus just warning us about God's discipline in this life or of losing intimacy with God, but not the fire of hell? No. Everybody knows what they're talking about. It's clear in those passages. They're warning both disciples and unbelievers about the fire of hell. Of course, it's very consistent all through the Gospels. And so now, after all of that consistent teaching where the fire clearly represents hell, the lake of fire, Gehenna, are we really then going to come to John 15 and say, oh, this is a different fire now? I mean, it's got to be, because Jesus unambiguously says that the people who are in him can go in the fire. Well, then it must not be the same fire that he's been talking about all this time. Jesus says in Matthew 7 that unfruitful trees are cut down and thrown into the fire. Well, there he's obviously talking about the fire of hell, of course. But Jesus says in John 15 that every branch in him that does not bear fruit is cut off and thrown in the fire, all of a sudden he's only talking about losing intimacy with God? Obviously, you can see why that's silly. And we need to stop playing these kind of games with the words of Jesus and just submit to what he says. Jesus is the Son of God. And I'm not sure if that really registers for a lot of us. He's the Son of God. He is the teacher. He is the interpreter. If he says something that you wouldn't say, or that seems out of line with a theologian that you like, well, then you let him correct you. Let him correct that theologian. Adjust your theology to Jesus' position so that you can now just say the things he says in the context of salvation and just let it be. Let it mean what it says. Of course, I realize that people may hear this and then point to passages like John 6, John 10, or Romans 8, and they'll say, well, those passages seem just as clear that we are eternally secure as John 15 is that we can be cut off. So what are we supposed to do? Just look at John 15 and ignore those other passages? And no, of course not. I'm not saying that. We look at everything the New Testament says, we bring it all together, and we begin with Jesus as our teacher and interpreter. And specifically, when it comes to the subject of whether or not we can be cut off, lose salvation or not, we look at those passages that actually deal with the issue of sin or lack of fruit in the life of a Christian and what the consequences can be. So yeah, there are a handful of passages in John and Paul's epistles that seem to suggest something like eternal security if you read them with these Calvinistic glasses on. But look again closely. What is Jesus discussing in John 6 and 10? Is he even dealing with the question of what happens to a Christian who goes back to sin or who is not bearing fruit? No, not at all. That's not the subject of those passages at all. But that is what Jesus is discussing in passages like John 15 and Revelation 2 and 3. Look what he says there. Or how about Romans 8, 28 to 39, a very popular proof text for eternal security? Look again closely. Is Paul dealing with the issue of sin in our lives and if that can separate us from God or cause us to lose our salvation? Not at all. But that is what he's dealing with in verse 13 of that chapter, Romans 8. Look what Paul says there. Additionally, read the writings of the earliest Christians, some of whom actually knew the apostles, people who grew up speaking New Testament Greek, who grew up in that culture. Read the writings of Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch, Clement of Rome, and read the whole thing. Read all of their works, not just a snippet. Read the Shepherd of Hermas, a very important early Christian writing. Read the epistle of Barnabas and the Didache, and just look closely at how these guys seem to think about the gospel and salvation. Look at how they talk to each other. Look at how they admonish one another. And you are not going to get the sense that these are once saved, always saved kind of guys. They were on a different wavelength. They don't think about the gospel like many of us learn to. And that's because they weren't being influenced by Augustine and the reformers and evangelical teachers and authors. And I don't think that those guys would be welcomed in most of our casual American churches today. Guys who actually knew the apostles, they would not last a day in most of our churches because they would make people very nervous and they would call us to a level of devotion that most of us have simply not signed up for. a level of devotion that they were prepared for because they understood the seriousness and the urgency and the severity of the reality that we live in, even as Christians. But see, we don't get it today. We don't understand what they understood for the most part. We don't see reality the way they did. And that's why our lives don't tend to transform in the ways in the ways theirs did. I understand this is kind of a not a fun idea to contemplate for a lot of people who may have been listening to popular evangelical teaching today. But uh, please try to think objectively about it and hang with me and consider these things um, as seriously and as objectively as you can. In the next podcast, I would like to talk about how all of this can help us better understand the epistles. It's going to take away some confusion and it's going to make things fit a whole lot better. And so we're going to take this teaching of Jesus, this image of the vine and the branches, and we're also going to look at one other passage in Matthew 13. And we're going to use that as a lens to that we can take and help us to understand the epistles. What happens if we put aside the Protestant theology that we have learned and use the teaching of Jesus as our, quote, reading glasses? And I think you'll see it works a lot better. Thank you so much for listening. May God bless you, whoever you are, and please let me know if you would like to talk. Thank you.